Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is an event that's part of the Aftereffects and Untold Histories series of talks and conversations and performances which NCAD is hosting as part of our contribution to a big European project being run by museums and educational institutions called Internationale. And we've decided this evening to focus on Yugoslavia and to think about the kind of performance histories that have yet to be perhaps adequately recorded in a part of Europe that went through a really extraordinary 1990s, a really very difficult 1990s. And I'm really pleased to be joined by three expert researchers who've been thinking hard about performance in the 1990s. And I'm going to make some just brief introductions to the people who will be in conversation this evening. So we have Vida Knežević, who's an art historian, a curator, a cultural worker, a member of the Kontekst collective, which is very preoccupied with politics and culture, and has worked as an art historian throughout, thinking about the 20th century, thinking about Yugoslav art and politics between the world wars, but also focusing on the 90s, and is part of an online publication called Prishtina, an educational project and left-wing magazine. We have Nita Luci, who's with us, who teaches at the University of Prishtina in Kosovo, and she's the chair of the Department of Anthropology and has done a lot of work in gender studies, and I'm hoping that we can have a gendered lens today for thinking about performance in the 90s. And her research has really focused on the intersection of nationalist politics, masculinity, memory, and also political movements. So we're very much looking forward to seeing how those might help us focus on this question of performance. And then Bojana Piškur, who's from the Dodona Gallery in Ljubljana, so one of our partners in the Internationale group. And Bojana's got a really extensive curatorial CV, but has recently worked on the topic of the non-aligned movement in Yugoslavia, which is a very important global lens. And that was an exhibition a couple of years ago, I think, now Bojana in 2019 maybe. And that she's been working really with a group, including everybody who's here today, on a research project to think about the performance and politics practices of the 1990s in a post-Yugoslav context. It's called Realize, Resist, React. And that's really the theme of today's discussion, to think about this mapping work, which is ongoing. And I think this is really important work because we don't perhaps have to think too hard about how difficult the 1990s was in the region, in Yugoslavia, a really traumatic period, the breakup of a country that was precipitated, I think, by fairly extreme nationalist politics that was stirred in the course of the 1980s. So the 90s is a period really of terrible violence and also a kind of a breakup of a social formation, a country that leads to emigration and exile, a dismantling of various forms of social and cultural structures. But of course, Yugoslavia was made up of different states and they have different experiences, different perspectives, and that's something for us to talk about a bit tonight as well. And I'd just like to put one side note before we start our conversation. And this is probably that if you know anything about Yugoslav art of the last 40 or 50 years and post-Yugoslav, it's probably to do with the very sharp spotlight that's been put on the 1970s and was genuinely a very vibrant period in Yugoslav culture. So there's clearly famous names, Tomislav Gotovac, Sanja Verković, Kotlin Lodic. These are all figures who've had quite a lot of attention recently. And it seems to me a little bit paradoxical that we know the 70s maybe better than we know the 90s. So that's maybe part of our project of discussion as well for this evening. So the format's going to be that our guests are going to make short presentations to bring us all up to speed. We'll move into a bit of a kind of conversation, and we'd really like to invite you in the audience to contribute questions. And you can do that through the Q&A function, the button that sits at the bottom of your screen. Please type in as we're going through this material, and I'll try and pause and spot the questions as they come, but there'll definitely also be a space at the end. And I imagine we'll be talking for an hour or so, maybe a little bit longer. So if that's okay, Bojana, you thought you might make a little brief introduction and then we might move to Vida's slightly longer presentation. Is that okay, Bojana?
Yeah, that's okay. I will first share screen with you. But thank you very much, David, and everybody for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk about our project. And that is, as you said, political performance in the 90s in the post-Yugoslav context. I hope you can see it well. So very short introduction about project. You already said some words about it, David. That this is the project of Moderna Galleria, that this is part of our many Europe's Internationale Museum Confederation. And we have started researching and mapping political performance in the region of former Yugoslavia 2 years ago, when I invited 10 colleagues to work together as a team, and Nita and Vida are here with us today. I don't know what is happening. Yes. All of us were born in the same country, in Yugoslavia, in the 70s and 80s. And today we all live in different post-Yugoslav states, as you can see here on the image. And while researching the 90s, one has to bear in mind that the 90s were a very difficult period for the whole region. And it's also difficult to find a common name for the region in the 90s and even today. So what is it? Former Yugoslavia? Is it post-Yugoslavia? Is it the Western Balkans? And this is something that is mostly used in politics, and it's the most neutral. So the 90s, what happens? The breakup of the country, ethno-nationalisms, the war atrocities, genocide, and the transition from one system, that of socialism, to another, and to that of capitalism. Our colleague Rok from the research group said, and I think he said it quite correctly, he said the 1990s were somehow postponed. So it's true, and it's especially true for Slovenia, because they were the glorious 80s with the civil society, with the new social movements and very specific cultural production. And all this constituted the so-called Slovene Spring. And then there were the 2000s, and that's the decade when Slovenia joined the European Union. The situation was not the same for the newly independent post-Yugoslav countries, not to mention Kosovo, which gained independence only in 2008. And I'm sure Vida and Nita will say more about the political situation in those countries. So the main questions of our research were, of course, the performance and the political. And we understand political performance not merely as some kind of witness to events that happened, but as a form of resistance against war machines related to power, to institution, to state, to identities, and even to language. So that's the kind of resistance that often emerged under extreme political circumstances, which was mainly the case in Serbia, Bosnia, and Kosovo. But in the broader terms, however, political performance also meant performing the political, which subsumes specific performative gestures as strategies of resistance and revolt. One important thing I would like to mention is also this, that those practices that we are discussing, they were not included in Western anthologies and overviews of performance, and this is especially the case before 2000. The few artists that were mentioned were mainly interpreted in the frame of Western understanding of performance, or were described as some kind of dissidents, voices from Eastern Europe, where Yugoslavia also, where Yugoslavia was included, even though it did not belong to the same political bloc. So, and this only changed when artists and theorists started turning back to their local histories, their local spaces, with the production, with the new production of local knowledge. And I have to mention this landmark exhibition from 1998 that was staged in Moderna Galleria and was curated by Zdenka Badovinac. And this exhibition showed the simultaneous existence of performance practices that, at least formally, did not differ substantially in the East and the West. And the difference lay elsewhere. And that was namely in different readings of gestures in different spaces where gestures acquired other meanings. In the performance of the 1990s, this so-called Eastern identity started to become less visible. And consequently, one of the arguments of our project is the following. With the dissolution of the two-bloc political system in the world and with the breakup of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, significant change took place. In search of new identities, the newly founded post-Yugoslav states turned either toward Western models or relied more on their local traditions, emphasizing ethnic elements, or opted for some kind of combination of internationalization, national symbols with a political embrace of multiculturalism. So I don't know, David, what do you suggest? Do I say something about the political performance in Slovenia, or should I pass the word to Vida?
Well, why don't we go to Vida now, and then we'll come back to you in the run, if that's okay, Bojana. That would be super. So Vida, if you don't mind.
Hello, thank you, David and Alicia, for inviting us to this interesting debate. I will just share my screen. I will talk about the relation between political and performative practices during the 90s in post-Yugoslav context, specifically through Serbian case study, as it is my field of research in the frame of the project and the following exhibition that Bojana briefly presented. I will briefly present some visual material related to the topic with some introductory remarks. And then through the discussion, we can talk more about the different aspects and complexities related to the presented material. When it was clear that the war in Yugoslavia would escalate at the beginning of the 90s, people started organizing in different anti-war initiatives and organizations. While the Yugoslav political elites, both on federal and republic level, were offering only nationalistic rhetorics, creating nationalistic narratives in once socialist, multi-ethnic, self-management workers' state, at least according to the Yugoslav state constitution, but in some segments also in reality, Yugoslav reality. In the same time, preparing the ground for the capitalist transformation of social relations, not many social and political actors left to fight these transformations. Among them were the most important, I would say, women's and feminist anti-war organizations and movements emerging from the left feminist movement in Yugoslavia, active and important during the 70s and 80s, remained mutually in solidarity, overcoming and fighting ethno-nationalistic discourses. One of the most important women's activist group was called Women in Black. The images of their performances you can see at the moment. And they were active from the early 90s, and they were still active. On the first, on this image presented, you can see one of their street agitation performances in which they interconnected complex relationship between gender, class, ethnicity, and sexuality, putting their bodies against the accelerated domination of sexism, militarism, war rhetoric, nationalism, etc. in Serbian society during the 90s. So with their bodies painted in black, they resisted the blackness of the Western culture, rejecting all forms of war, of militarization, of violence. At the same time, it represented collective and public solidarity in silence. So they were stood in silence as resistance to killing cities and people. As a contrary to the traditional function of black, when women were mourning in private space, they carried their bodies to the main squares in Belgrade, but in other Serbian cities, as a visible, as a public political gesture and statement. Back then, many progressive artists, although at first at the beginning of 90s, took the position of active escapism from the brutal social and political reality that surrounded them, left the institutions and started creating its own spaces of resistance. They started organizing spontaneous exhibitions in their own private spaces, houses, in public space, initiating new para-institutions such as famous and very important space Culture for Cultural Decontamination and the Rex Cultural Center, opening space for many visual, theater and performing artists, thus giving them necessary infrastructure, logistic support, space for work, meeting point, possibility of collaboration, possibility of socialization. Coming out from the public institutions as a way of resistance, or for the new generation of artists never going there, and going out in the public for some artists meant changing the means of production, the way how art is perceived, what social role art can have in these turbulent times. So after the decade of domination of postmodern trans-avant-garde art, dominant in the 80s in the Yugoslav context, with the domination of monumental paintings, sculpture, and drawings, artists such as group Škart or artist Mikrob that you can see now at the image presented, are directly or indirectly turning to critical avant-garde practices, very important in the Yugoslav space during the first half of the 20th century, such as Dada, Surrealism, Zenitism, etc. So this social turn, as defined by art historian Claire Bishop, after the end of globally significant 89, when real socialism was finally defeated, meant bringing back artists in everyday life to ordinary people, communicating to them directly with a simple language, combining different arts such as poetry, visual arts, performing practices, do-it-yourself aesthetics, with visually strong messages, often very poetic, but at the same time witty, and with the critical comment on the surrounding violent, masculine, depressive, pauperized, aggressive, and privatized everyday. During these turbulent years of the Milosevic regime, the period of closed society that was marked by the brutal war atrocities, the destruction of Yugoslavia, inflation, poverty, migration, economical sanctions, growing chauvinism, huge mass demonstration on the street during the whole period of 90s. At the end of 90s, NATO intervention and the collapse of the mentioned regime at the very end of the 90s, actually during the 2000s, in many times, art was accompanying the civic and students' resistance movement and massive demonstration of people in the streets. But progressive academic and already institutionalized scene formed around the long-standing art collective-led art that you can see at the presented image. They expressed its resistance to the official art system with an attitude of non-acceptance of instrumentalization by institutions, a refusal to participate in demolition, in slaughtery, robbery, bullying, and with a decision to move out of traditional art spaces. Using atypical exhibition spaces such as freezing chambers, refrigerators, ice rinks, garages, streets, artists gather around LED Art Collective with the concept of frozen art addressed, then the key socio-political events by the effect of shock and provocation. By performing acts, they strongly provoke the public to resistance and rebellion. The group Magnet, active during the 96, 97, 98, strongly influenced by the legacy of artistic avant-garde and neo-avant-garde art practices from Yugoslavia, through its numerous guerrilla performances and explicit public actions using symbolic language, most often understandable to the general public, aimed directly at government officials and directly addressed their representative institutions of power, from Radio Television of Serbia, Serbian Academy of Science and Arts, the National Library, the National Bank, as well as the police and the building of Presidency of Serbia, for which reason Nune Popović, one of the most prominent members of the group, was often detained and arrested. So artistic practices within mass civil and students' protest. So the street theater, performative actions, various site-specific performances, performances of situation for mass civic and students' demonstrations became their discursive polygon. So produced by already mentioned CZKD space, and its director, important feminist and peace movement activist, Borka Pavićević, this street performance that you can see now with the title Macbeth or It, was conducted in front of the police cordon and 100,000 people during the 96-97 massive demonstrations against Milošević. So they brought Shakespeare's text and performance in life, referring to Slobodan Milošević and his wife Mira as Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Through repetitive, passionate gestures that were gradually progressed into grotesque dance of power, fight between life and death, it represented Milošević-Marković tyranny that lasted during the whole decade. The performance ends when both dancers literally enter the cage that you can see also in the image. So all these examples of performative art practices coming from the field of political activism or visual arts or theater were very important in the politicization of ordinary people back then. People taking part in massive demonstration, but they were also important in articulating resistance, reaction, making it visible to the language or of art, specifically with the language of performative art. Thank you. So we can stop here and I will continue with my comments in the next round.
Great. Thank you so much, Vida. That's an amazing image, right? That's really extraordinary. And I'd like us, if we could, to come back to the question about the distrust of institutions. That seems really, really interesting. So if it's okay, Nita, would you mind going next and making your short introduction?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, although it is Friday. and end of another month that went by like this. I remember when we were scheduling this, I said, oh yes, end of April, it's good, and it just came. But it's wonderful to be here. So what I'd like to can talk about today briefly in this part of our sort of get together is based on the piece that I wrote together with a colleague, Nita Luci, a colleague from, that I work with together quite a bit. And it sort of circles around this idea of a small island of unofficial truths. And so if we go to the next slide, I'll start with what I've prepared. I don't necessarily have a lot of images. I have 2 images that I want to share, but more in the line of text. And I'll leave this first slide here as I present about it, and then we'll move on to the next one. Generally, as we were sort of doing our research for this, it wasn't necessarily something that the two of us as an anthropologist and sociologist had approached as our other colleagues who are art historians and curators and artists themselves. So we had quite a bit of trouble finding that hook on how to get into it. And so by accident, we as we were seriously contemplating the archive and performances we remembered and couldn't find archived at the same time, we went online, watched a clip from a recording of a theater performance that we had both attended when we were actually in high school at that time, at the beginning of the 90s, and just could not stop laughing. And so to us, it seemed that there is something very powerful to this comedy. There was something very powerful to the humor that was making us laugh. Maybe it was out of this extreme anxiety that we kept missing deadlines to actually submit this. And then we found it. It seemed that there was this incredible kind of potential and power in humor and in comedy. And so that's really what in no way will I present today or in our text we provide for a survey of or sort of a whole mapping of what it was the art scene at the time in Kosovo, but also in the absence of what might be conventionally defined as a performance art. We then decided to look at the intersection of what was interesting to us, which is the intersection of representation, power, and violence. And then to look at this one particular play, this one particular comedy, Profesor Jam Taljentsiju Mahi, which is actually a rendition of a very popular Yugoslav play Audicija. And in this case, it's called Professor, I'm a Talent Indeed. So it's a sort of an audition of students want to be actors in front of their professor. And so here we kind of focus on comedy and humor as artistic performance and show the way in which they're context bound. So while we're unpacking the performance, we aim to also unpack the context in which it occurs. Ultimately, fundamentally, we argue that humor is also interactional, and as a cultural product, it relies upon shared norms and ideas, but it can also shape new discourses and practices, as well as create a sense of agency and the tools for social protest. So we can look at how this was the case in this particular rendition of a play. This also happens at a very particular time in Kosovo when, following Kosovo's revocation of autonomy and the installation of special measures through Milosevic's regime, that all public institutions throughout Kosovo are closed. So media is closed. By the end of '92, about 90% of all public employees in public institutions who are Albanian will have been fired from work, and sort of Albanian society in Kosovo designs what has been called a parallel society, parallel state. And with this, it was also educational institutions at the same time. So the Dodona theater that we looked at also functioned as a space for multiple purposes. It was a puppet theater in the daytime for children. You could do rock concerts in the evening, but it also staged everything from Othello to these comedies. So it was kind of, it emerges as an interesting space outside of that normal functioning of institutions. What we also look at, so we're looking at how we're arguing that Dodona actually became this small island for telling particular kinds of truths. And I've selected here a couple of just some snippets from the play. You will see the first one says, history will speaks if just or if it unjust. So intentionally, we look at specifically the way in which language was used and performed in these plays. So this kind of grammatical inaccuracy that is built into this particular scene is played by someone who's come in to put in a word, to intervene into the audition process so that their candidate would be selected. However, he goes on to recite a 1960s poem that references brotherhood and unity. And as he does this, he ends with this saying, history will speak. So the fact that history might speak, I think, is relevant in this case to kind of think through a little bit more, that if it is just or unjust. So it's a particular interesting moment where different kinds of historical narratives are being unpacked and are being questioned in ways that might not have been the case before, or where one of the actors tells the director, who in this case was Faruk Begoli, says in Era Delisi, this is one very famous Kosovo film, he said, tells Begoli, you played the partisan and I played the ballist, and the ballist were the nationalist front during World War II in Kosovo and Albania. Says, you gave me 2 bullets in the head in the name of people, but now I forgive you in the name of the people. So there's a confrontation of different kinds of readings and narratives, and it becomes possible to say particular things that perhaps up to that point it would not have been possible to say. This is interesting that it's happening at a time where if, as was the case with one of my parents' friends, you got drunk and went out in the street and yelled Kosova Republik, or called for Republic of Kosovo. Not everybody was drunk who would say things like this, but you would end up in jail. So it is very relevant to think about how this space of critique and protest, in a way, theater, in this case, Dodona, becomes an extension of protest, especially at a time where the first 2 years, 89 to 92, the more massive demonstrations that would have been in the streets had now subsided. So there was kind of a withdrawing from the street, especially once martial law was imposed, and new kinds of private, semi-private, semi-public spaces were being constituted in order to perform some kind of sense of the politics and the political. What we do is also kind of look at select scenes. We intentionally select particular scenes. We have actually, I will say here that there are some important ones that we did not treat in this piece and remains for another time, for another issue, specifically in regard to issues of racialization and racialization of Roma. We do, in a way, also touch upon the patriarchy in its multiple kind of forms, but just very little. So I think what we managed to do in this case was just really scratch the surface of this. As I said, this recitation here on, history will speak if it's just or unjust, brings to question also that which had been publicly silenced, and not necessarily the truthfulness of the event in regard to Boris Vukmirović and Rami Sadiko, who kind of is said to have died in each other's embrace and became the dominant signifier of brotherhood and unity in Kosovo and in throughout former Yugoslavia, but actually just how just were the structures of the system that was built upon that particular event. So what is really being surfaced is not necessarily the violence and of the regime that emerges in that moment of the 1990s, but actually is a reckoning with and a questioning of the Yugoslav state, federal state itself. And this speaks to the ways in which Albanians had been constructed as and portrayed and experienced Yugoslavia in many very different ways from let's say, the more privileged centers. Not to say that privilege was kind of, there was no privilege within particular kind of locations in Kosovo as well, but that for the larger part, Albanians had remained the ultimate other, the kind of the ultimate other in the Yugoslav imagination and the political practice as well. So Dodona really starts unpacking this and in ways that it had not been done before. We also show and tend to argue that Dodona was made into a social space, kind of that brings to mind Bakhtin's idea of Carnival, in which there's this social and political hierarchies are temporarily suspended, whereas social hierarchies function by means of obscuring the contradictions, both making disorder possible and threatening to destroy comedy actually, as exposes those. And more so than tragedy, offers a radical view of that particular moment. There is, on the one hand, there was the relevance of creating and maintaining comedy, that it can be a form of resistance, especially to a tendency to reducing subjectivity to victimhood. So this is something that does emerge throughout what we're looking in this performance and the narrative and particular understandings of subjectivity. And we propose that it is actually this maybe unlikely character, Amela, who we focus on, and this third citation here that you see. Amela kind of comes on stage, and she is from Rože, which is in Montenegro, is a border town with Kosovo, and is performs kind of a new kind of subjectivity. She is kind of has lost ground. It's unclear whether she's Albanian or Montenegrin or Muslim, or so she says, I'm a Bosnian delight, but I'm also Shqiptareska. So she is in many ways the product of a patriarchal gaze and of the patriarchal writing of this play. So in no means would we want to romanticize what this play actually constructs in terms of the difference of not just of gendered experiences, but the sexualization and also of those experiences. And at the same time, provides and invites an interesting kind of critique, because Amela talks about her working class family. She talks about how she was class secretary and class president and then school president. And she says, although she comes from this provincial border town, she's always been involved in the arts. She's always loved the arts. And then she provides a critique of the Bujovani, of the leaders of the time. She says, they make me make them coffee, and is a particular kind of experience that does remain unsaid in many ways, that because of this idea that somehow all kinds of differences in Yugoslavia had been overcome, that there was a lack of recognition of not just the ethnic hierarchies and racialized hierarchies, but also of class hierarchies. And she makes that visible. And in perhaps the most kind of visible act of agency, invites the professor for them to actually come up together with a new political party, which she says will call Sisters Djokovic. So because everybody's now saying that she's a spy, she is this untrustworthy, nobody trusts her anymore because her ethnic belonging now is in doubt and it's unclear who she is. So we tried to surface a number through these different kinds of performances, really the complexities of the social and political context, if you will. Also, maybe go to the other slide, then we'll because I think maybe I'm not sure how I'm doing with time, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what Dodona maybe looked like. It was a very narrow space, not a big theater. As I said, it was initially seen just for a puppet theater, for children's puppet theater. But once the Kosovo theater had closed, it became the one location where both the faculty, the drama department held its classes, where plays were being put together and so forth. And here I just cite Shkilzen Malici, who in this monograph for Dodona says, and just to kind of a shout out to him because he's right now in hospital, so hoping that he'll be better. It says that Dodona kind of became a site of art of resistance, but also resistance as art. And so, although if you do look at a number of the reviews of the time, they were harsh. The plays were not great. The reviews tell you that the plays were not necessarily of best caliber and so forth, but they played other kinds of purposes as well. And just to finish off with the last slide, where as we were also researching this, we wanted to include something that was not necessarily this performance from the theater, or might not even have counted as art, because it was so public, it was so mass produced, right? It's a comic from a newspaper, and where we have a little boy intervening into the Serbian coat of arms, the four steel Cyrillic S's, and with like very simple gestures, he transforms its both the iconography, but also its meaning. So whereas to many, it would not have been visible, it seems that from the position of the margins, certain acts of violence are more visible than they might be to others. And just one of the jokes in there, which we regard as kind of exemplary of the difficulty of also documenting and recording, and then the violence of the time, and also receiving recognition. So kind of an attempt to bring together the representation of recognition and justice. We won't get into that here. And so there is this very interesting, we think, scene where this guy by accident ends up on the stage, and then tells his ordeal with the police. Apparently police had stopped him and said, what are you doing? He said, well, nothing, I'm just working the land. And said, whose land? He said, well, corn, but this inability to comprehend or to recognize Serbian, because he tells it in Serbian, is an additional play with the dominant representation of kind of the ignorant Albanian peasant who does not speak Serbian properly, which then is not only turned on its head, but further becomes, has actually been a joke since that time for almost 30 years now, right? So if you ask somebody, what are you doing? They will tell you porn. And it's understood that it is an attempt to recognize that the moment of violence at the time had been about borders, but instead of talking about borders, he's talking about corn, which we could think of, as a matter of livelihoods and so forth. But I'll end there, and we can, yeah.
Thanks, Nita.
Thank
It's very
you.
interesting. I think humor might be something that we could come back to. That's very important. So Bojana, would you mind also then just taking us through some of your introduction?
Okay, yes, I will. I will continue with this last slide. It's going a little bit slowly. I don't know why. I don't know what happened, but it's just not responding anymore.
We're seeing it from the inside of the presentation. I wonder if you could turn on slideshow, whether that would make it.
Yeah, from current slide. Okay, yeah, okay, great, thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, what was once so-called common Yugoslav cultural space, and we heard, of course, this space was more common for some than for the others. So this space was, after 1991, divided into many local art scenes that were very different from one another and were all marked by particular context, as we saw in Kosovo and in Serbia. In Slovenia, contrary to Kosovo and Serbia, the 1990s were a period of development of art system. So not only the art institution, but also many new NGOs, many new hybrid spaces, artist-run spaces, and so on. So this was a period of also some kind of enthusiasm, the beginning of contemporary art and the opening to the global art world, while the rest of Yugoslavia had to deal with more traumatic circumstances. So when we started our research, of course, research of political performance, the questions appeared, questions such as, what did performance, which was then an already established art form in the West, what did performance bring to, mean, or change in the broader field of art in the 1990s in our region? Can we actually talk about the performance beyond the political? Is performance even the right term for such a vastly varied production in then the newly founded states from Slovenia to Macedonia? So there was no common or shared understanding of performance in the region, which was primarily the consequence of considerably different socio-economic and political circumstances. And this was the main difficulty of our project, I would say. So its unifying thread was not a search for similarities, but rather just opposing of certain absences. What is also what one can observe for the art scene for the 90s in Slovenia is a considerable unresponsiveness or silence about certain political events, such as the wars and war-related crimes in Bosnia and Kosovo, and also this silence in the case of erased citizens of Slovenia. So erased citizens of Slovenia, this is something very traumatic because it involves more than 25,000 people. Most of them were from the other ex-Yugoslav republics that were at the beginning of the 1990s erased from the registry of the citizens of Slovenia, meaning that they lose all their rights. So the erased citizens still bear, even today, the consequences of this act. In the context of the 90s Slovenia, we really cannot speak of political performance as such, of course, with a few exceptions. There were some political events that can be observed in the frame of performance, as they included artistic elements, and such is this case that you see. Organized by Women for Politics in 1991, which is actually important demonstration in front of Slovene parliament, even for today, because they were protesting and demonstrating for the Article 55 for the right to abortion. But these elements that were included, the artistic elements were, for example, Christmas tree decorated with condoms that was delivered to the parliament, or the action with throwing eggs and similar. And I think this kind of political events that included artistic elements, the term that was later used, especially from the 2000 on, artivism. Well, a bit different case is this Matjaž Berger's state celebration, which is also in a way typical for this early 1990s. So, as I said, there was no political performance as such in Slovenia, and for this reason, we have adopted the concept of the so-called cultural performance in order to understand performance in a broader sense. So this broader understanding also includes situations, tactics, social sculpture, transition into social space, and such practices were symbolic political gestures of a kind. They were primarily aimed at exposing, even though without directly confronting, the mechanisms at work in institution, gender, social, class, identities, issues of public space, etc. So we identified a few groupings, and my departure point was from the visual arts in Slovenia, and my two colleagues, Rok and Jasmina, they covered theater, which I will not mention now. So the first grouping deals with the state, with territories, with political rituals related either to political manipulation, the systems of power and control, or re-territorialization. So in many ways, this was the continuation of the retro avant-garde of the 1980s. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Also within Internationale, there was exhibition of Neue Slowenische Kunst a couple of years ago. So one example, as you see it, is NSK State in Time. The other would be Novi Kolektivizam, which we are also including at the exhibition. We are including the posters and this photograph of the action. And then the next one would be Dragan Živadinow's project. And Dragan Živadinov formed the Cosmokinetic Cabinet Nordung in 1990, based on the avant-garde tenets of Russian constructivism and suprematism, setting as its goal what he calls the culturalization of space. So that's the first grouping. The second grouping has to do or involves the body, so-called body art. And here in this context, Kapelica Gallery needs to be mentioned here, as it's an art space in Ljubljana that has played a pioneering role in radical physicality since the mid-90s, challenging archetypes, identity politics, sexuality, post-humanism, and bringing the body to extreme limits. Here is an example of Ive Tabar's medical performances. And this is the Eclipse tandem of artists with their sexual explicit performances. And for example, one example of what was happening in Kapelica Gallery is also projects like this. Goran Bertok's sadomasochism. And from this performance, Bertok also produced a series of black and white photos that we will show at the exhibition. And this one, which is a slaughtering a calf in another gallery in Ljubljana called Sputz Gallery by the project by Franz Purk. And this project stirred a lot of controversy at the time in 1998 when it happened. So then the third grouping is this grouping that also is close to the concept of relational aesthetic, where specific micro situations are created or institutional critique in the form of fictional or parasitic systems. And it's also about the relations involving the other when the personal becomes political. I'm just showing one project from this grouping, and this is Tadej Pogačar's Kings of the Street, where he worked with the homeless. The next grouping would be the machinic, so-called machinic performances, and that can also be understood as resistance within electronic networks, and this was especially important in Slovenia. There were many people involved in this, many new spaces, many new networks. And in Slovenia, this included virtual reality, net art, cybernetics, and within this also geopolitics, surveillance, communication, cartography, and networks, etc. And then the next grouping is very extensive video performance production, also in a way relates to the 80s, continuation of what was happening in the 80s. And there is one example, Marko Kovačić, No More Heroes Anymore from '92. And then there would be Laibach group, which released the album NATO. And they toured Europe with this album on the so-called Occupied Europe NATO tour, which ended with a concert in a war-torn Sarajevo in 1995. And then we would also include at the exhibition the media covers, specifically the covers of Mladina Weekly, which is the most critical, the most important political magazine in Slovenia since the 80s and up to today. So that's one particular cover from the 1995. So this is in brief from the side of me, what was happening in Slovenia in the 90s and what we plan to include at the exhibition.
Great, thank you so much, Bojana. That's super. That's a really big overview there of a kind of rich and complex situation. Maybe if I could just dip in with a couple of questions, but also invite anybody who's in the audience here to please use the Q&A function. Be very happy to share your questions. So just to jump back to Vida, you made a very striking point, and I think this is probably a question for everybody, but you described a reluctance on the part of artists to engage with institutions in the 1990s. And in a naive way, you could say that in earlier periods in Yugoslavia, artists had managed to somehow take control of institutions because things like student centers had been very, very much kind of artist-led, and there'd been close relationships. And you could even stretch the argument and say that artists had achieved some degree of self-management. So what happens in the early 90s that makes these institutions that had been appropriate places for the development of new, perhaps more experimental forms of art, what makes them incompatible places? And is that also true of other parts? I mean, obviously in Kosovo, we're talking about a very tense political situation, but is there a generational change in terms of the management of culture in Slovenia as well? So Vida, would you mind starting?
Yes, it's always very interesting to discuss the context of Yugoslavia when you know a moderator really shows that he or she is familiar with the context. So yeah, but it's very, very helpful and important. Yes, as you said, during the 70s, institutions such as the Students' Cultural Centers and other institutions were, we could say, in artists' hands. So artists and cultural workers were occupied them. They were given by the state to work in the sense of self-management. And of course, this is debatable whether it is the function of pacifization of students' protest going on the decade previous, or it is something that is real practice of self-management that were going on in students' cultural centers back then during the 70s. But what is the fact is that the scene during the 70s was very vivid. You can just see it by mentioning the case of feminist movement that was very important back then, and that traces its roots to the 90s. So this is the continuation of left feminist politics that was very important during the 90s, as I mentioned. But at the beginning of 90s, what was happened was that Milosevic regime kidnapped all public institutions, bringing right-wing cultural policy that was accompanying dominant right-wing policies, state policies. On one hand, it was nationalistic policies. On the other hand, it was the beginning of the privatization of state apparatus and introduction of capitalist social relations. So many artists and cultural workers didn't feel comfortable working anymore there in these public institutions. So they went out. They were going out in the public spaces, creating their own parallel or para institutions, no matter it was in the field of theater or visual arts. So as I mentioned, the two were very important. Cultural Center for Cultural Decontamination, with the main figure Borka Pavicevic, and the other Rex Cultural Center, which opened the space for many artists, activists to come together, making a kind of alternative, critical, independent artist and cultural scene that is still going on and that is still very important and present in Serbia, as political elites from the 90s are still present in Serbia parliament through the Socialist Party of Serbia, which is still parliamentary party, Milosevic party, and the other party that is the main political party, which traces its roots from the right-wing political party from the 90s. So still there is a going on some kind of antagonism between para or independent art institutions and public institutions that produces or reproduces right-wing state policies.
I think we might come back to this because it's a question about the present as well. What does it mean to make an exhibition to revisit the 90s? But if I could just ask Nita, is it possible to, you were talking about the particular position of this theatre, but also a kind of coded reading. When do we get truly alternative institutions being formed in Kosovo, or is that really much later?
Well, I would say that it is an alternative institution already, perhaps, Dodona, because at the same time, although there is this parallel society, let's call it that, being constituted during that time, there is also an emergence of kind of public institutions. Obviously, previous socialist state institutions are now close to Albanians in Kosovo. However, through the new political parties in this moment of pluralism and democratization, so right, political party pluralism, the emergent political parties also engage in particular kinds of cultural production that rely heavily on folklore, that rely heavily on particular kind of selection of tradition in order to, through particular artistic performances, artistic expressions, to communicate the political. So and I'm speaking about Albanian political parties at the time. So Dodona is not that. Dodona is neither the existing state institutions, pre-existing state institution. It's neither this kind of, it is parallel, but it is outside of, it attempts to remain, and it remains outside of the influence of the emergent and then dominant political, Albanian political parties. So there is, and also the work, if you, by the end of the 90s, if you look at the work of, especially coming from the Faculty of Arts with kind of an upcoming generation like Sokol Beçiri or Mehmet Beluli, they intentionally talk about kind of the way in which then the political parties had pacifized the potential of art to be more radical and to confront the situation. So they, in many ways, do remain outside of that. To think of the current or sort of post-war context, it's, I think, maybe a little more, not necessarily more complex, but I'm wondering how we might want to define independent, right? Because very often what might be defined as independent is that they are not reliant, let's say, on public monies. However, they will have been reliant on international donor support. So the issue of independence, I think, is something that we might needs further elaboration, but yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Vida, you talked about a difference between a kind of maybe a Western orientation and a local orientation, which might be one way of thinking about that. But if it's okay, Bojana, could you reflect a bit for us? Is there a generational change? Is there continuity? And I'm thinking about those, particularly that institutional question.
Oh, well, generational change, I don't know about that, but for sure is that already in the 80s in Slovenia, culture played a very important role. And this was the so-called alternative, something that I also shown as a first grouping, the NSK, and the similar important role in the formation of independent states. And so much important that it had been considered a constitutive element of a new state. So what happens in the 90s is, of course, the culture still plays a big importance, but it's a bit different situation than in the 80s, because all these tectonic changes happen in the art sphere. For example, it is the beginning of what we have now, contemporary art. It's also the beginning of this realization of the idea that if we will not self-historicize ourselves, then if we will not historicize ourselves, others will do this for us. So that's why, for example, in Moderna Galleria, with new leadership, Zdenka Badovinans in the early 90s, this focus on our local specificities and wider in Eastern Europe. With the setting up of new collection and so on. So the 90s also, this development of many new NGOs, some already existed in the 80s, but now many new appearing. And then, as I said, also other spaces, artisan spaces and so on. And in 1993, the occupation of Metelkova which is a very important event also in the 90s. And Metelkova is actually former Yugoslav military barracks. They're also part of Moderna Galleria, where I'm actually sitting now, is located. And then the 90s also the Soros foundations, which were also important for the whole region. So this is what we have, and this focus into the West, into the global art world, opening to the world. So Slovenia was a really good student. So what happens in the 2000s, Manifesta 3 happens in Ljubljana, and this is kind of reward to us. This event was not only artistic, of course, but was also political. Positioning of a periphery, of course, we are still periphery. Let's not, let's not say that it's something different, but the position of periphery in the global art system, and at the same time recognition of Slovenia as the first transition state to join the European Union a few years later. So that's about what the situation was in the 90s. Of course, the 2000s, it's a different situation again, but the 90s in particular is this growing of an art system, and this turn to the West on one side, and this local self-historization.
Well, we have a question that's come from Saskia Holmqvist, who's going to be speaking as part of the series that we're running. And I'd like to take your point, Bojana, and ask her question and add a little to it. So Saskia thanks everybody for their presentations. Bojana, could you elaborate on why you think there was what you describe as an unresponsiveness to the war in performance in the 90s? And just to take that a little bit further, was it necessary to have this amnesia in order to do the globalization? Was it important in a way to turn away from Yugoslavia in order? Was it necessary not to think about the war in order to become more international?
Oof, that's so very difficult question, because we don't even know the answers to that. Because what happened is that this unresponsiveness in some cases shown that the artists were so traumatized, even in Slovenia, by what was happening in Bosnia, that they stopped doing art for some years. And there are a couple of cases when the artists went to the refugee centers and worked with the Bosnian refugees, instead doing social work instead of artistic work. And also people, this is more typical of this theater scene, but when people from the West were coming to Ljubljana, they said, people, what is happening here? We don't have an idea in Ljubljana that the war is not far away from you. There is this total like blanco about what is going on in the rest of former Yugoslavia. And I don't have an answer to that. Why was this so? And why artists weren't more involved in these issues? I guess they were dealing with this period, which was traumatic, I guess, also for the artists here in Slovenia in different ways. And maybe I would just mention this this event that happened in Moderna Galleria 95. This was the seminar conference, Living with the Genocide, where the artists did get together, including some world curators. I know Marina Abramovic was there. It was organized by Zdenka Nibor-Zabel. And then they were talking about these issues. You know, what is the responsibility of the artist in the time of war? Does the artist have to be political to respond to war or not? You know, and when is art political at all? Is art apolitical? Is it possible to be to do apolitical art in a very politically charged times? So these are questions that even if we ask artists, they wouldn't know what to say to that. But what you said, it was this one of the reasons to turn to the West. I guess that people have to delete somehow everything that was before and then just start a new look somewhere else.
I mean, what's coming
like that? But this is really, it's really tough question, really.
But what's so striking is that what you've all pointed to is, to a certain extent, a kind of repression that occurs in the 1990s, despite ostensibly being a period where there was greater at least in principle, some kind of greater freedom of speech, right? It's the end of Yugoslavia, and there's suddenly the possibility of different voices to be speaking, but actually there's a lot of repression and forgetting that's going on as well. Vida, what would you say to that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think because at least Serbian society didn't succeed to emancipate itself from the burdens of 90s. The mentioned questions are still very important for artists to think about it, to reflect it, to try giving new answers and perspective on the 90s, but also looking at the contemporary perspective, but also for the future. And I think when we are analyzing this whole period, I think that what we have to take into consideration is the lack of, strong political actor, left political actor that could put a broadened political horizon that then these critical art practices, performing practices could rely on. And it is, for me, it was very interesting that at least in Serbia, there were two historical and theoretical interpretation of the mentioned art practices. And on one hand, it was the theoretical interpretation that insisted that the performed, engaged, alternative, political, artistic, and cultural practice had leading role in changing of social paradigm. And it was, coming from the liberal theoretical interpretation narrative that art alone can offer a political alternative to society. And in relation to such interpretation, the others were looking at the failures of such engaged artistic practices in bringing about political and social change. But from this contemporary perspective, maybe it is time to realize that social change could never be brought by artists themselves, and but could be of help in giving an effort in creating a new independent art scene that I already mentioned, which is very important in present days. But very important in preserving and transmitting of critical art practices in the field of performing arts. We can say that these practices represent a continuity with artistic avant-garde practices that were very important during the whole 20th century in the Yugoslav context. When we think about the avant-garde practices in the first half of 20th century, Dadaism, Nadrealism, socialist realism, etc., but also the practice after the war, neo-avant-garde practice, etc. So they are these critical practices that I was talking about, were building a bridge with contemporary critical art practices that have always been in some kind of dialectical connection with the political, even in the situation of its absence, as the case was in the 90s.
Nita, what do you think about that?
Well, I would perhaps say that a different kind of speech becomes not only possible, but mandatory in many ways in the 90s. So that, as you were asking, shouldn't there be more of, because now there's this opening up. And I think that the new kinds of structures that are emerging also require particular kinds of speech and subjectivities, so that both demanding a sort of a critique of the previous without necessarily, Bojana said something about this unfinished, was it, or the 90s? There was this one comment by one feminist activist in Kosovo that the 1990s were also unfinished and unfinished activism, because they sort of were interrupted in some way by the war, but then became repackaged through the new kinds of political interventions. So there were particular kinds of political interventions. Just to, as anthropologists, there's some, people started writing CVs differently. Right? You started to write a different, it was no longer this little bio where you said was born in the village of and finished high school and so forth and moved on to the big city. So now a CV is written very differently in that moment. And Vida was saying, this is a time of new capitalist social relations. And I think that is very important also to recognize the time, so that there's also both commodification, there's also new kinds of processes and new kinds of representations of self that become relevant or demanded, and also practices of belonging and of national belonging, which are felt very differently, experienced very differently. And I think that is one site that I don't necessarily know how to kind of further elaborate on right now, I think. But in the context of Kosovo, I think there was so much during the late 70s that you can't necessarily talk about the avant-garde as you would in Serbia or in Slovenia. It is actually a time of, I would find reference to a different kind of context, so kind of uplift. So it is a moment of modernization. There is faith in modernization practices of institutions, and there is also a commitment to building particular kinds of also pedagogic institutions, so that it is very much about it being proper in so many ways, while maybe for a short period of time has kind of a semblance of critique. But it is very much about kind of proving oneself, because of the way in which Albanians had been positioned in that kind of hierarchy in former Yugoslavia. So, and but then that lack of that kind of critique later becomes, I think, a very important kind of inspiration for another generation. I would say that there's been a bit of a shift actually in Kosovo. There is kind of, you can identify different generations. But there is also, I think, kind of a fascination both on the part of other parts of Yugoslavia, and a fascination from international Western observers. We speak about this actually in our piece a little bit, with kind of this, the noble savage, I think, kind of is one kind of archetype that appears quite often, kind of somebody of being steeped in tradition. So different kinds of tropes, I think, that are being played with and perhaps engaged with in this context.
Yeah,
they need to be dismantled, and that's why we'd say that what then, from the point of view of also witnessing that, it's about, I think, kind of unpacking or showing that phenomenology of privilege, which remained so invisible to these centers of power in Yugoslavia.
Yeah, so thinking here about class. I've got a question from Tom Creed in the audience, and this probably is most appropriate for Bojana and Vida, but maybe Bojana first. Are many of the artists we've heard about this evening still active? Has their practice retained its or remained in its political dimension, or has it shifted?
Good question, because I think all of them that I mentioned are still active, and I would say most of them are on the streets today, because in Ljubljana, since April 2020, every Friday there are anti-government protests. that were started with this activist cultural front, and many artists are present, and while we are talking, people are bicycling around the parliament. So yes, for sure, they are active, they do art, they are politically engaged, maybe in a slightly different way in the 90s, but yes, they are here, they're present, I would say most of them.
Vida, what would you say?
Yeah, a similar situation is in Serbia. And while I was researching and making contacts with all of them, actually what is going on at the moment is that they are preparing a kind of, small celebration of 30 years of their activities. So a majority of them are still alive, working, but what should be commented is that they're still on the margin of art system. So they still, majority of them took this, have this position of, critical margin.
So we're coming towards the end, and maybe this is a kind of last question for all of you, and to the audience, if you would like to ask a question, here's your chance. I suppose I'm very interested in what it means for you individually and then collectively as the project, the exhibition, to go back in time to the 1990s. Because I imagine this is an extremely difficult period for public culture in all three countries. People made their reputations, people made corrupt reputations and got privilege in this time. So there's a lot of vested interests at work here. There are questions about behaviors and attitudes and so on. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about what it means to do this work today and what the difficulties of that might be. Any thoughts there? Vida, could I start with you?
Yeah, what is interesting is that at the moment, at least in Serbia, there are few projects and exhibitions dealing with the 90s.
Oh, okay.
In the main Museum of Contemporary Art,
Yeah.
The retrospective of a very important woman photographer, Goranka Matic, with very, very important photographies of the major events during the 90s, as she was art photographer, news reporter, connected to alternative art practices in visual arts, theater, etc. But there is another exhibition also. This is the part of a museum and in collaboration with a small independent art organization, Remont, the retrospective of another very important protagonist of the 90s called Fleka. Then in the mentioned CZKD space, there is another very interesting exhibition that is set up as a work in progress, a kind of retrospective of artist Microb that I already mentioned. So obviously there is a huge interest into going back to 90s. But I think that the reason is this, continuation of political situation in Serbia, at least. Tracing the answers, trying to find some, new perspectives, how to deal with at least, cultural field, art field, but it is always in relation to political, as we see still that political elites are completely, kidnapped the public institutions.
So this is positive for you, strongly positive, right?
Positive that we are searching for answers, but negative because we cannot emancipate ourselves from the 90s, you know.
Not for sure.
Okay, I take the point. Nita, could I ask you the same question, really?
Yes, okay. I dropped out for a little bit again. Oh, fun. Actually, I think maybe in this question, I'm finding the answer to your earlier question as well. What was the question? I forgot. Could you? Well, I was thinking that, but the connection threw me off.
Just a broad question about really what does it mean for you to go back and work on?
Oh yes. Well, I think there's certainly been in the past couple of years a revival of the 90s, and in many spheres. So whether in terms of in journalism and in print, in wanting to uncover through archives, narratives, the stories there. In my work, for me, the 90s was 5 years ago. So just so so it's not necessarily that kind of a detachment or a perception that it was such a long time ago. I have more hard time remembering what the 2000s were, but the 90s is a different story. And I think for a number of reasons, and you do find actually today, some of the, I think, interesting work that is done in this regard with people who are, for example, through new kinds of digital platforms, looking at whether it's Rilindia as a publishing house in the newspaper, or looking at other kinds of relevant institutions of knowledge production at the time, and wanting to find new ways of making those present and available in public. It is also because the past 20 years have been saturated by the story of the war told from the perspective of a militarized and a militarized kind of masculinity, manhood as well, and a glorification of that kind of fighting back. And whereby there was kind of almost a forgetting of the long 90s and the civil resistance of the 1990s. So it took 20 years, I think, in Kosovo to also, it's very much connected to new kinds of commemorative kinds of engagements. For example, this very one I recommend exhibition on Once Upon a Time, so that it would not happen again, which is an exhibition of children victims of the war that's actually very well done. One of the few that's been very well done, that looks at the civilian experiences of war. So this shift to look at civilian experiences of war has also generated more interest in not just on the part of researchers, but the broader public to look into the 90s again. Now, there's always the danger of it again being, and it already is being hijacked, obviously politically, by all kinds of cultural entrepreneurs, but there is an interest.
Thank you, Nita.
Can I also say something for the Slovene situation in the 90s?
Yeah, please.
We have lots of celebrations in Slovenia this year. It's the 30 years of the independence of Slovenia. But this is just one-sided celebration and something that they want to impose just one side of history. And this is this Slovenian nationalism. And on the other hand, the erasure of everything that has to do with Yugoslavia, with all these emancipatory practices of that time. And it's about a certain revisionism. So even with this project and with a couple of other projects that deal with this Yugoslav history of the topic of Yugoslavia, and even post-Yugoslav context, we already had some issues here in the museum, because, as you know, our government is right-wing, conservative, and it seems like direct continuation of the politics from the 1990s. So I think in this regard, it's also important that we have this exhibition here in Ljubljana, and it will open on the same day as this other celebration of the 30 years of independence will happen. So we will have this exhibition with this post-Yugoslav issues and ideas, and then this other one, the really nationalistic one. So I think that's why it's important. And of course, to look back at the 90s as something also that went all wrong, you know, the worst that it could go.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe just very final question then, and I think just to Bojana, if that's okay. Ivana Marjanovic, if I've said her name right, I apologize if not. Ivana's asking if you could say a few words about the whole project, the international partners that the exhibition's part of.
Yes, of course. Hello, Mariana. This is, of course, the project that is run by Moderna Galleria, but it's Moderna Galleria. It's a partner of Internationale Museum Confederation. Internationale Museum Confederation has been going on for already 10 years, and we are partners with Dublin. What is the official name? Dublin School of...
the National College of Art and Design.
Yes, you are one of the partners. And then there are partners from Istanbul, SALT, is the name of the institution, Museo Reina Sofia from Madrid, MAGBA from Barcelona, Van Abbe Museum from Eindhoven, MAGCA from Brussels, and we have Warsaw Museum of Modern Art, and we have from Sweden, they're called Wallen.
Academy. Yeah.
Yes, so that is our confederation. And of course, the topic of this last Internationale project is the 90s. So we are all researching 90s in one way or another.
Well, I think we should finish, but I'd really like to thank our three speakers for a really fantastic evening. I'm very appreciative because it's later for you than it is for us as well. And Bojana, I imagine you want to be on a bicycle outside, right? Cycling around the parliament. But that was, thank you, it was fantastic. So thank you, Bojana, Vida and Nita. I'd just like to say a word to our audience, just to say that if you go to NCAD in public online, you can see that next week there's a series of conversations that are taking place on 3 different evenings or afternoons as well. So if you check there, you can see material that will be maybe not quite as good as this evening, but still excellent nevertheless. That was a bit cheeky, I shouldn't have said that. So if I can say thank you very much to our 3 speakers, and hope that you can join us the next time we're holding one of these events. Thank you. Good night.